off their camera if they wanted to. Are we good to go? Okay, I see the recording is on, so we're starting the recording.
I am failing here. I opened the slides up and now they, have disappeared. So let me find them. I'm so sorry.
It's all right. I'll get started with the introductions. Joining us today, we have guests from the Third Door Coalition and Downtown Emergency Services Center. Third Door Coalition is a civic alliance of business people, nonprofit providers, academics, and others who are working to solve chronic homelessness in King County through permanent supportive housing. And they announced their proposal in May after 2 years of research and analysis, and that's something Chad will be speaking to us about. And Chad Mackay is one of our guests from Third Door Coalition. He is the co-founder and co-chair of Third Door Coalition. He's a business leader in the hospitality industry. His company, Fire and Wine Hospitality, operates both iconic and new Pacific Northwest restaurants and hotels such as El Gaucho. And Chad is active in organizations like Washington State Hospitality Association and Visit Seattle. He and his family live in North Capitol Hill neighborhood. Also today with us from Downtown Emergency Service Center is Del Lausa, who is the Senior Program Manager of Housing. Downtown Emergency Services Center is one of the nation's pioneers in getting people experiencing chronic homelessness off the streets and safely housed through permanent supportive housing. And Del has worked for 7 years on helping to house people and keep them housed. She currently supervises DESC's housing facilities, including 2 in North Seattle near Aurora, which is particularly relevant to the folks that we have on the phone here. I believe one of these facilities is in the Bitterlake neighborhood. And DESC is a partner of the Third Door Coalition and has helped shape its approach. Also with us from Third Door Coalition, we have Catherine Henriksen, and she is a community advocate with Third Door Coalition and most recently was director of Seattle University's project on family homelessness. She will be posting resources in the chat, so at any point, if the speakers are mentioning certain links, you can see that in the chat, and Catherine will be helping with that. Also, she'll be fielding questions in the chat, so if you have a question, a clarification or something about what the speaker said, you can post that in the chat and she can reply to you actually as we go on with the presentation. And so the way that we're going to have today's presentation is that Chad is going to speak about Third Door Coalition's work, and then Del is going to speak, and then we're going to go to moderator questions. And after moderator questions, we will have questions from the audience, and I'm going to try to keep at least 20 minutes to half an hour for that. And at that time, I'll also go over the controls that you'll need to be able to ask questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Chad from Third Door Coalition. Chad.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me see if I can get fired up here. All right, Anastasia, give me a thumbs up if you see my screen and you can hear me okay. All right, I appreciate it. Name's Chad Mackay, run a company called Fire and Wine Hospitality, and I'm going to give you a little background on who we are as Third Door Coalition and kind of the roots, and then I'll go to the beginning of the presentation. This is all online at our website as well. 2.5 years ago, Sarah Rankin came and presented to the Visit Seattle board, and she was presenting right between the head tax being passed and it being repealed, and there was just lots of acrimony. And she came in and talked about hope around chronic homelessness, that we could actually do something, but the process was broken, and that it was going to take civic leadership outside of government to restart and rethink about things. And I have to tell you, Sarah is a lightning rod for a lot of business owners and downtown associations, because she's usually the group suing us around panhandling laws and all this kind of stuff. And through that, we became friends. We started talking about what would it take to restart the conversation about how do we deal with chronic homelessness, especially. We'll talk about those pieces. And what we agreed is that we could set aside all of our other differences and focus and work on one thing that we both wanted to solve. And I think that at the root was where we started, was around a collaborative process using data, not drama, a singular focus, setting aside our differences to work on one thing that we wanted to solve. We become great friends, and I think that the ability as civic leadership, as and I'm not going to talk big politics, but national, regional, city politics, just divisive, broken. I think it was a breath of fresh air to have a group that wanted to come together, focus on one task, and set aside all of the other stuff. Let's just see if we can get it done. And so I went out and recruited business leaders. She recruited the service providers, researchers, others that would help. And we built, I think, a really dynamic team of all volunteers that really wanted to move the needle and actually see what we could do to solve chronic homelessness. And so you can see the names up here, but just really dedicated people to do that. And again, I want to talk about it as a collaborative process, singularly focused on chronic homeless. And we're going to go talk about what that actually means and what our solution is. And then I'm going to try to keep it brief. The other piece I will say, just because for me it's a personal issue as well. My father and my family taught that if you're going to complain about something, you need to put up. You put up or shut up. So if you're going to complain about something, you better do something about it. So that was when I met Sarah, and at the same time, my boys were commuting, riding their bikes to a school over in Queen Anne, and they've come back with these fantastic stories about things on fire and drugs and like all this crazy stuff going on in Burke Gilman. And then one day I came home and they were playing homeless camp in our basement using all the couch cushions and blankets. And I thought, you know what, we've got to do something. And that was when I met Sarah, and really that came together from a personal perspective and said, I need to be a part of making something happen. We talk about overall chronic homeless versus homeless. There's about 6,500 people, give or take, depending on the counts, that are chronically homeless. This group is about 29% of the overall homeless population. A lot of the homeless population comes in and out. They're rapidly rehoused. There's different pieces, but the chronic homeless are there for a while. We'll talk about what the actual definition is. They tend to be the ones that are the most visible and vulnerable, the ones that you see on the streets. They're the ones that you see in the parks. They have high rates of poor health, chronic disabilities, mental illness, and they're also the most costly to manage. And there's some great articles on our website about this. But Malcolm Gladwell, 10 years ago, had produced an article talking about $1 Million Murray, and Murray was a homeless person, I believe in Denver, and had passed away, but everybody knew Murray, and he went back and calculated the cost of having Murray on the streets, and it was $1 million. This is 10 years ago, and the rest of his article talks about the issue of it's sometimes more expensive to manage a problem than to solve it, and that is really where we're coming from, which is this is an economic cost that's unbearable to keep people in this situation. We'll talk about what that means and the expenses around it. Sorry, I got to keep rolling down here. Okay, so the definition, this is a federal definition, which is important because there's some things that trigger with that. And I'm not the full expert. There's DSC is absolutely the experts on this, but in general, if someone's chronically homeless, so they've been homeless for more than a year, or they've had episodic homelessness that tallies up to more than a year, and they have a qualified disability besides being homeless that makes it hard to work. So it could be a substance abuse, it could be mental illness, it could be a chronic health condition that really is devastating. And in most cases, now that we know this thing called comorbidity, it's actually a comorbidity situation where they actually have multiple things that are adding up. So it's very different than someone that experiences a brief episode of homelessness. our proposal is really around housing first and housing as a foundation. And if you went to business school or any college, studied psychology, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it really talks about the baseline physiological needs, and then safety, love, and belonging. What we talk about is you cannot access the higher levels without taking care of the base. So you want somebody to come off of alcohol or drugs or get mentally stable. It does no good just to pull them out, put them through a program, try to put them on meds, and then stick them back out on the streets. You have to give them safety and stability for them to start to be able to access those needs and to actually be able to fulfill. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really a primary piece, and as both housing as a foundation and why we talk about housing first, and then you add in the other services. Just for those that from a financial perspective, and also we'll talk about a resource perspective, it costs the same to provide 3 days at Harborview, 3 months in jail, or 1 year of supportive housing. Right? So 1 year housing somebody, 3 months in county jail, or 3 days at Harborview. I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't like to waste money. And so having the in and out at Harborview, thinking about, oh, let's just lock people up, these are not solutions. Permanent supportive housing is a solution that helps people recover their lives. Want to touch base on permanent supportive housing, because at first I'm a business person, so I was like, oh, from a marketing perspective, PSH, permanent supportive, can't we like repackage that as something else? What we came back with is no, because it's really important. It's permanent, meaning they become tenants and live there as long as they want with a lease, and most are going to stay there for the rest of their lives. And when we talk about the demographics and age, you'll start to understand why it's almost a forever deal. Supportive means they need to have, you can't just put them in the normal housing situation, give them a voucher and put them in an apartment. They need help. They need help to recover. They need help to start to rebuild their lives, case manage, get reconnected in the system. They may have disability payments, other things. And the other is that it's actually housing. They actually sign a lease. They give 30% of their income as part of that, whether it's a disability payment or other pieces. And so it's their place. They get a call at home and come back day after day. We've shown a couple of pictures of what does supportive housing look like. Most chronically homeless are single individuals. And so the housing that occurs is typically at 80 to 100 units, because you have 24-hour on-care, on-site presence, as well as facilities for social and caseworkers and other meeting facilities. And then you have basically what I call a single efficiency dwelling unit. So a small apartment building, a studio apartment building. So they look great. They're integrated into the neighborhoods, and both Plymouth Housing, DSC, and Catholic Housing Services have done a great job integrating in. We are short about 6,500 units of permanent supportive housing within King County. So when we look at the gap of housing the chronically homeless, what is being developed, this was as of May, and I'm really happy to report that King County recently, for the county executive, proposed 2,000 units of supportive housing in their budget, his budget, and that the mayor in June, I believe, had put out an RFP to put 600 units of cost-effective, quickly built units, really using the language that we talked about. They had to be built within 2 years, about half the cost of normal supportive housing. So the good news is we've actually gotten an update to this and have had an impact so far. The traditional model of building supportive housing, from just kind of looking from the outside, there's a lot of pieces that go into it. So there's grants and tax credits, and you need to cobble these together, and it ends up being more costly than it should be, but it is what it is because of all the stacks that come through. So what we've talked about is how can we change what are called capital stacks and use private money and public money and maybe put them separately so that we can do it in a faster and cheaper way. So deliver the same quality of product, but do it quicker and at less expensive. And there's a whole presentation on the website regarding our cost drivers and our top 10 that we think we could achieve significant savings. We've talked about doing a public-private partnership framework, and that is developing. That may be a state-level investment board where private entities can put in, as well as public dollars that are matched, done in a different framework for developing the affordable housing, the permanent supportive housing. I'm going to skip these pieces just because it's all on the website. We're talking about how do we get a net impact of about 15% to develop a unit. We think that there are some sites that we can do that even at a greater level. So we've proposed in total, there's about 1.6 billion that needs to be spent to build those units overall. We've looked at a mix between business, the county, state, and the cities for raising those funds and how to do that. And I think the piece, and I think this is why we're here today, is to talk about we don't all have to we don't have to share the same reasons for caring about it to actually solve it. So if you're somebody that wants to feel safer, you're somebody that wants to help people, save money, all those things, we don't need the same reason to actually deliver a result that's good for everybody. So again, that's the leadership of the board. We have lots of other people that have been involved. At this point, we just became a nonprofit, but otherwise it's an all volunteer board. So just for a summary, our proposal is really built on data impact and trying to partner and not attack each other, but look at how can we come together to solve. We're focused on the most visible, vulnerable, the people that when people think of homelessness, this is what they think of. It's actually the chronically homeless. We want to be collaborative. We don't want to battle and try to blame each other. That's why we took it out of politics for a while, and we're bringing it back in to hopefully see if we can have a more collaborative conversation. And you're starting to see the impact, I think, on the language that the mayor and the King County executive is using. And we don't have to agree on everything, but just that PSH is a great solution. It's most cost effective and humane. Yeah, with that, I think I don't want to take up any more time versus get into the questions. So I think there's some.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Next up, Del, if you want to say a few words before we get into the Q&A, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I have worked at DESC for about 7 years, almost. It was a career change for me. So I kind of went through the process myself of figuring out what is this housing first, what is this harm reduction, and it didn't necessarily seem, you know, it took me a while to actually watch it work, to understand that it does work. You know, I think Chad pointed out that whichever direction you come from, you know, whatever reason you're interested in solving homelessness, whether you just, you know, have empathy for people who have to sleep outside, or whether you want to make sure your tax dollars are spent in the best way, or that emergency services and hospitals are used efficiently, whichever direction you come from, housing first is the proven answer. And when I say proven, if, you know, on DESC's website, we have a whole tab. It's a pretty rich website and has pages and pages of studies, you know, academic studies showing that housing first really works. And I thought I can do this a little later if folks want me to do it. But since I've been doing this for 7 years, I started actually at the front desk of one of these buildings, keying people in when they forgot their keys, calling medics if they had a medical emergency, getting in between folks who are having a little disagreement. So everybody like ends up happy and back in their units, running little community events, all of that kind of stuff. So I think it might be helpful at some point for me to just walk through what it's like to be a tenant when you enter the building for the first time, and what that kind of experience is like. So I can maybe do that a little bit later. But I think, we've got Hobson Place is going to be opened in about a week. It'll be our 14th PSH site with DESC. And I think the most compelling little snippet of information to begin the discussion is that we have about a 95% retention rate on people who are housed in PSH. And that is an amazing statistic to me, but it's because the supports are there for people who have not been able to retain housing without those supports. They get the right kind of support, the right kind of structure, and they're able to retain that housing permanently in most cases.
Thank you, Del.
Yeah.
We'll now go to I think it'll probably be about 20 minutes of moderated questions, and then we'll do a little tech controls break where we explain to people how they can ask questions, and then you can ask questions at that point. So the first question that I have is for Chad. And the question is, in the recent social justice protests, including the discussion around Black Lives Matter, there's been an emphasis on the need to center marginalized voices in any discussion of solutions to social problems. What is Third Door's coalition approach to this? How do you work directly with individuals experiencing chronic homelessness? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at that question, and I think there's a lot of different ways. I mean, we've talked about ourselves as a board in terms of how diverse are we, and what community are we coming from, and how do we do a better job encapsulating more voices. I think the answer around, are we engaged with groups that deal with chronic homelessness? 100%. I mean, I think DSE, Plymouth Housing, and a number of the people, that's the work that they've been doing for 20 plus years, and are leaders nationally on that. Me personally, I feel like the marginalized voice is that of the chronic homeless. And so I'm proud to be able to represent that. I met with a gentleman called Red, who had been chronically homeless, in and out of jail, drugged, been stabbed. I mean, had grown up in a violent household, and he heard what we were doing. He had gone through the Union Gospel Mission program, but he'd heard what we were doing, and we had lunch together, and he said, Chad, the thing is, people always say that homeless turn down the services. He goes, and that's true. Like, if you want me to go to a shelter or want me to do stuff, I don't want all these rules, I don't want all these other things, but they never offer housing. He goes, 98% of the people I know on the streets right now, if you told them they would have their own bed, their own place to stay, would take it. And they would cherish it and want to keep it. And he goes, whatever you're doing, whatever Third Door is doing, I want you to know there are people praying for you and hoping that something happens, because they'll take it. So the marginalized voice that I want to represent is that of the chronic homeless, the people on the streets, because where's their voice? So anyway, I don't know if that helps, but.
No, thank you. Thank you for that response. And Del, you mentioned you can speak to kind of a day in in supportive housing, and I have a question that I think is related to that as well, which is in North Seattle, specifically in the Licton Springs neighborhood, there were concerns with increased trash and trespassing around discontinued low barrier tiny house village, and even in the Holler Lake neighborhood, which is the neighborhood that that the community club is in. There was also discussions about introducing a tiny house village south of the high school that we have here. How is permanent supportive housing different from the low barrier tiny house villages that we had, for example, at Licton Springs? And how do you address concerns from neighbors?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the tiny house villages at Licton Springs, but I know a bit, and I think the main difference is Chad pointed out in his slide that permanent supportive housing is permanent, so it isn't just a temporary situation. It's your actual home, and you can stay there as long as you want to. I think psychologically that is a huge difference for people. People who are chronically homeless are used to having to move around. They just get settled and now they have to go somewhere else. And I've actually had people say to me when they move in, after the whole outreach and the lease signing and everything, people will key them into their home, and people will say to me, how long can I stay here for? How long am I allowed to stay? And they just, it's difficult for them to believe that they're actually going to get permanent housing. Once they do get permanent housing, I think, if there's a buy-in to make that work that you just don't get in a shelter situation. And the tiny houses, while they're more weather resistant than a tent, it's still basically a shelter temporary situation. I think that's a big difference. We also, in permanent supportive housing, we provide that support. And so when you're moving into one of our buildings and we do the lease signing and we give you your keys and you walk into your apartment, we don't just turn around and leave you there and walk away. We have at least 2 staff typically around the clock in that building. And during the day and some of the early evening hours, we have a lot more staff than that. So, just really simple things. We're super responsive landlords. If you have a problem with your toilet, we are fixing it today because we don't want that to get out of hand. If you move in after 20 years on the street and you're not really sure how to do laundry, we have people there that can help you do your laundry and teach you how to do laundry so that you can do your own laundry going forward. If that's something that you never master, those people are always there to help you do that so that you can maintain a certain level of living. If you have a behavioral crisis, we as landlords, we're kind of experts at managing that sort of situation, and we can usually diffuse a situation and get people back on the right track before it ever escalates or goes further outside the building. And if you just want someone to talk to at 2 in the morning, we have those staff there. But we also have staff during the day who will knock on your door and say, hey, I noticed that you don't have any benefits. I think I can get you a Social Security check. Would you like to work with me? And we don't, we don't force anyone to accept services, but those services are always there. And even people who don't accept those formal case management services, they get a lot of help. Maybe they need to go to the doctor at 11 in the morning. They can say, hey, could you give me a wake-up call at 10? And our staff will give them that wake-up call, and they'll come down and, you know, here's where my doctor is. Can you print out a bus schedule? You know, and we can help them solve those little day-to-day sorts of problems that come up so that they actually get to the doctor. And, you know, if you're chronically homeless, and you've got to get to the doctor, you know, it just isn't an easy thing to do. You may have to bus across town and you don't have a bus ticket, you know, and you don't have a way to look up which bus goes to your doctor. But we can provide those supports in permanent supportive housing. We do it day in and day out. We also, sorry to, you know, just to acknowledge the concerns of neighbors too. What that means when we come into a neighborhood is that, you know, there are chronically homeless people throughout the city, and you know, people notice that that number is increasing, and folks are increasingly in areas where people with houses and children see chronically homeless people and are, you know, maybe concerned or frightened or just worried for the people, you know, whatever it is. But because we have 24/7 staffing and because we have a pretty robust management staff on site, if there is a problem in the neighborhood, like we're the first go-to people. You know, hey, someone was, you know, sleeping on my porch last night. Well, it's probably not one of our tenants because they have their own place to sleep. But we'll figure it out. Sometimes people have a little hard time adjusting. Maybe it isn't our tenant, but we are still pretty good at engaging folks, and maybe we can have a chat with them, direct them to more appropriate services. And, you know, we can just be, and we are, and we certainly work hard at being good neighbors to help folks solve problems, whether they're directly connected to us or not. We're kind of the experts in the neighborhood for that.
And you mentioned, I think in the context also of what you're saying, that you could speak to what a day in one of the locations that you run, what that looks like.
Yeah. So, right. So, you know, I sign my lease and I move in, and I'm shown my apartment, and now I'm alone there. There's a intercom on the wall, so I can call down to the front desk and assure myself that someone is there and can meet my needs. Maybe I don't know how to get the shower knob to work. Someone will come up and help me do that. You know, I'm a tenant now, so, and I have my apartment, so I can do whatever I want to, as long as I'm not infringing on other people's ability to enjoy their apartments. So maybe I'm going to watch television. Maybe I'm feeling a little uncomfortable because I'm used to sleeping in a shelter with lots of people around me, and I don't quite know what to do. So I might come downstairs at 2 in the morning and chat with the staff, and they'll tell me a little bit about the neighborhood. Maybe I'll go back up and I'll go to sleep. About 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, staff will announce that breakfast is being served. I can come down, I can have a meal, even if I don't have any income at all. I can get something to eat. And then obviously my morning is mine. I'm a tenant, so I can come and go as I please. Maybe, you know, maybe I'm gonna take a shower because I finally have a way to do that now. And I'm gonna go out into the community and I'm gonna explore. I'm gonna see where the parks are. I'm gonna see where the doctors are. I'm gonna get some groceries, whatever people do. And then maybe I'll come back to the building, and you know, some of this has changed with COVID, unfortunately. But under normal circumstances, maybe there's a gardening group, or maybe there's a group walking around picking up trash in the neighborhood. There might be a substance abuse support group, people trying to get clean and sober or trying to limit their alcohol use, supporting one another with some staff support as well. Maybe my case manager is going to work with me on getting Social Security, as I said before. You know, I'm going to eat dinner, and pre-COVID, that means I'm going to eat dinner with my new friends in the building. Now it means we're going to deliver your meal to your unit so that you don't have to come down and interact with folks if you don't want to, but you can. Throughout the day, you know, at each of those kind of morning, evening, afternoon, if I'm on medication and I've agreed to this, I'm going to have staff remind me that it's time to take my medication. And most of the time, again, with my permission, it's up to me. Almost everyone agrees to this and appreciates it, but staff actually hold the medication in the office. They call me, they say, hey, you haven't come down for your afternoon medication. Oh, I forgot. I'll come down, I'll take the medication. Staff will, you know, keep a record that I took it so that other folks who are on my care team can kind of, you know, be aware if I stop taking my medication, that's maybe a problem for my health, could point to behavioral problems down the road. And so they're going to keep an eye on that and kind of, hey, you know, what's going on? And maybe I need a medication adjustment or something else is going on. But, you know, I have this care team around me kind of looking for ways to help me adjust and, you know, build a meaningful life and troubleshoot any of those barriers that come up for me day to day.
Thank you. And there was a question in the chat that was related to what you were speaking to, which is how do the apartments get furnished?
Right.
And I think, yeah.
Yeah, we have a great fund development team that runs a program where individuals and organizations can sponsor the furnishing of the apartments. I mean, we purchase basic furniture like a bed and a chest of drawers, and then we have community groups and individuals who purchase with our help, and then outfit these units with, you know, bedspreads and dishes and all the kind of startup stuff you need when you move into a new apartment for the first time in, you know, 10 or 20 years, and you don't have the cash to do. So you come into a very nice, clean, warm, homey apartment, and you know, I've seen so many people walk into those apartments for the first time, and I love doing lease signings. It's one of my favorite things because that's where you get, you know, that's where you get the human payback. I mean, it just feels like, wow, this is a fantastic thing, and you can really celebrate with that person.
Thank you for sharing that. Chad, this question is both to you and Del. In your work with, you know, both the chronically homeless and people in the community, what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about unhoused individuals or the issue of homelessness, specifically in our community in Seattle?
I mean, I'll go back to my opening statement or the beginning, which is you'll hear that people, you know, homeless turn down services, and so, you know, they don't really want help. But I think the biggest misconception is services is not housing. When you offer housing, they take it. When you offer a home, people take it. And so I want to disabuse the notion that the homeless don't want housing. They may not want to be in a shelter. There's a lot of reasons for that. They may not want to leave their people, their dog, all those other pieces. But when you offer them housing, that is different than shelter. It is permanent. It is housing, and it's supportive.
Del, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one, Chad. I think, you know, I hear the same thing, and my answer to that is the same. But, you know, my answer, you know, the most misunderstood aspect, I think people don't really realize who chronically homeless people are. You know, I think they think they know who they are. But, you know, there's this way that being chronically homeless filters people into having this same experience, and they kind of start to look to housed people the same. But every one of those individuals has their own unique story before becoming homeless. And I've known Boeing engineers, I've known law professors, I've known housewives, a Safeway butcher. I mean, people with it can be any one of us. Any one of us can experience a series of events that ends in our being homeless. And once you're homeless, it becomes more and more difficult with every day that passes to get out of that situation. You know, in living or working in this role and living in this city, you know, I have my "what if I become homeless" plan in my head. And I know from talking to really hundreds of people at this point that that plan is almost certainly going to fail. Because someone's going to steal my phone, or, you know, something is going to happen, and it's every time something happens, it becomes more and more difficult to recover from that. And I just don't think people who have not experienced homelessness fully appreciate how difficult that is and how each of us is vulnerable to that.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to ask one last moderated question, and then we'll go to, we have quite a few questions in the chat, and I'm sure people have other questions they'd like to ask. So there's been a lot of conversation in Seattle and around the country about around the issue of defunding the police, and some of it has correlated to issues around mental health and, you know, how police departments respond to that. And then Seattle City Council has taken some steps that are meant to be seen as responding to this. What do you believe neighbors need to understand about the interactions of chronically homeless and the criminal justice system as it is today? And that's to both of you.
I'll start. You know, I have worked, again, on site in PSH for about 7 years, and I have had many interactions with SPD. And I would say that, you know, almost always the officer is trying to make the situation better. But that officer doesn't typically have the kind of training that, you know, a mental health professional would have, and doesn't necessarily understand, you know, they're working through their training, the way they've been trained to handle a situation. I think that more robust responses from mental health professionals would go a long way to making our response to mental health crisis more effective. And you know, the other piece of this is that when you're homeless, when you're chronically homeless, you have to survive. And so a lot of the interactions with police have to do with, you know, trying to stay warm, trying to feed yourself, trying to solve these basic needs. You know, Chad talked about the Maslow's hierarchy, just, you know, food, shelter. And so, you know, one of the solutions is permanent supportive housing, because you take all of that need and you solve it, and you don't have the number of interactions with police that you had when you were on the street, because you've got those basic needs met, you've got staff to help you, and it just rarely gets to the point where you do have to call the police or have them intervene in the situation. There are just better ways to address those situations before you get to the police.
Yeah, just my interaction with Carmen Best and a number of police is they don't want to be the cops to deal with the homeless. They're in a terrible place, and yet city leadership, county leadership, others have basically dumped it on them, and you as taxpayers and as public have dumped it on them, and they're not the best to solve these things. And we take this population that is highly vulnerable, that is pimped out, sent around. I mean, it's a horrible situation, and we have to think of it more holistically and not blame the police. We've got to look at it as, how do we help these human beings? And we know jail is super expensive, and we're in and out. And, I watched the videos of interactions trying to calm somebody down who's having a mental episode, and it's going to take all of us in different services to come together to help those individuals. And I will tell you that the officers that have been responding and doing different things, is I am clearly a business person who cares about episodic things happening on our streets. They don't want to be there either. They don't want that position. And so how are we going to support the city and the county with services to have alternative responses than calling 911?
I think it's really important to point out too that, and this kind of goes back to the question about misconceptions. In most cases, chronically homeless people are going to be victims rather than perpetrators of serious crimes. They are vulnerable. They are dealing with all of the comorbidities that Chad talked about, and people prey upon them, and so I think a lot of people think of homeless people as dangerous, as chronically homeless people as dangerous, and they as a group they're not the folks out there committing violent crimes.
Thank you for answering that. We are ready to go to Q&A from folks. I will show just a few controls here. Bear with me, please. How do I share? Oh, here's the screen share. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So here's the system we have going, because everybody's muted. So we have some questions in the chat, and we'll go to those first. But if you'd like to ask your question in person, use your voice and via a video, what you can do is, if you go to this participants control, there's this raise your hand icon. You can raise your hand, and when you do that, it'll pop up here under the participants list for us, and it'll do it in the order that people are raising their hand. And so we will then unmute you to ask your questions, and then you can ask the question to our guests. What's actually going to happen is one of the moderators will unmute you, and you'll get a pop-up on your screen that'll say a moderator is asking you to unmute. When that happens, please use the unmute icon. So you can have it on the bottom left here, or you can do it under the participants list. You can unmute yourself there. And then once you unmute yourself, you'll be able to ask your questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And Catherine, let's see, I see you pasted a couple of questions. Catherine, do you by any chance know who we have? What were the first questions? Let's see. Okay, while we're figuring out questions in the chat,
How about
which,
Forrest Bauman asked one recently?
sorry, Ethan, can you read out the question, please?
I'll just push Forrest Baum. Could you ask your question in person if you'd like? If not, we can read it out.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just wondering. So there's so many homeless people in this, and I want to help support housing, and it seems like every time people get started talking about it, they argue about it, and it's like, okay, but we don't want it here. So how do I support it in my neighborhood?
So, but I can answer a little bit. We've come up with a number of cost drivers, and some of those are some potential zoning changes and type codes for permitting that allow permanent supportive housing as its own thing, so they don't have to get variances. The other piece I think you need to let City Council know, we need lots of different housing across the city. And this isn't just a permanent supportive housing piece, but it is housing overall. And to be able to tell other people that, you know, maybe are like, oh, we don't want to have those people. What I ask is, do you have chronically homeless people in your area now? And do you want to keep them that way? And there's not a neighborhood that I've gone to around here, unless you're behind some gated community, that doesn't have an issue. And so wouldn't it be better to put them in a place where they're safe, where they have access to services, and in a way that is cost effective for all of us, and that you can walk by and go, hey, you know what? There used to be a bunch of people here, and now they're in there, and they actually have a life to be rebuilt. So write your city council, support organizations that are doing this. And when you hear other people talk about NIMBYism, say, it's already in our backyard. What are we going to do? If you're in Ravenna Park, what do you want? You want to keep them there? Or would you like to do something that is more positive? So I don't know if that helps, but that's my position is it's already here. So let's do it in a way that is safer for everybody and is actually healthier for everybody and frankly cheaper.
All
Anastasia,
right.
I'm sorry. Now that I'm unmuted, do you want me to go back and?
Yes, and that's Catherine. She has the list of questions in the chat. Please go ahead.
Sure. We had a question from Patricia about the application process. Is there a wait list? Is housing available for people re-entering the community from prison? And what about registered sex offenders? So that sounds like a good question for Dell.
Yes. Yeah, there is something called coordinated entry for all that most of our applications come through, and it's a regional process. They can come through DESC or a number of other providers to get into that system. We use assessment tools that assess vulnerability, and so we are trying to prioritize the people who are the most vulnerable out on the street. And there is a huge waiting list. We have, I don't know what the waiting list is, but we're about to lease up Hobson Place, and we will not have any trouble doing that. We will tell people, no, we don't have room for you. Sorry, I'm not sure what the rest of that question was.
Oh, do you have any restrictions on who is allowed to live there?
Oh, well, no. Housing first is housing first. So if people have had problems in the past, we are going to be willing to house you. Now, if someone has, it isn't usually the case, but if there is someone with a particularly difficult background, we'll go case by case. But the idea of housing first is that people are going to be housed, and then we will address in partnership with that person any kind of needs, any kind of treatment or behavior needs that they have. And I mean, I just have to reinforce how much easier it is to do that when you're housed than when you're trying to figure out where to sleep and is somebody going to steal my phone for the 5th time this month while I'm sleeping.
And let's go to a question from one of the folks we have with the raised hand. Arik, I believe, I'm unmuting you if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Eric Skirdahl. I'm new to these meetings. So I want to say thank you first to the Broadview Bitterlake Community Council for extending an invite to North Helpline. That's how I got here. I'm currently the North Helpline board chairperson. And I also want to say thank you to the Holler Lake Community Club for your Halloween food drive. That sounds really awesome. And that's really cool to hear that that's happening, hopefully supporting the Bitterlake Food Bank that we manage. And also just thank you to Chad and Del for your insights and your presentations. I did post a question in the chat around kind of capital, but I'll maybe leave that in the chat.
Go ahead and ask it.
Okay. So caveat here, I am a former nonprofit affordable housing developer. So I'm trying to like way ratchet down the wonkiness of my questions. So I have a question both on the capital side and on the operating side.
I'll get right at it, Eric. I totally understand the capital stack funding, and we absolutely want to break that up. And if we need to combine the public sources and the private sources to help compress both the time and the cost, that's one of the proposals we've been looking at. Is instead of these mix, how could we take all of the strings attached funding and put it in one, and then put private in another, and be able to really change that cost structure. So we're absolutely tackling that. And just for people on it, how you fund these things and what's involved changes the cost of actually building the units and at the end of the day. And so just understand that there's some strings attached to different funding mechanisms that actually drive up the cost and versus bringing down the cost. And so 100% we're tackling that. We've actually even talked to some potential funders to create alternative insurance vehicles to fund the reserves. So the permanent supportive housing have to set the reserves and basically keep this large cash pile set aside. We've actually looked at different ways to basically buy an insurance policy to cover those things so they don't have to develop that much cash up front. On the operating side, it's about $21,000 a year to keep somebody housed and supported in permanent supportive housing. We believe that is a long-term tax stable funding source that needs to occur. And that is one piece that we really looked at. We thought the capital could move private funds or different non-restricted funds could change the cost to deliver the housing, but the actually ongoing operation probably needed to be a broad-based tax or something that continued to fund as a society. We would take care of that. And we're tax agnostic, so we're not trying to say, oh, do a tax, not a tax, everybody give money, we don't care. Like, let's come together, let's figure out how to put these funding together and get the most bang for our buck. So I don't know if that answered your couple questions.
Catherine, who do we have next, if you know by any chance?
Sure. I was just answering another question. Let's scroll back up. This is a quick one I think Angela had asked. Is permanent supportive housing the kind of project that is being talked about at Aurora and 143rd? And that's a good Del question. Del, does DESC have a project in the pipeline there?
Yeah, I think that's the Bitterlake project. And we have, yes, that is underway. We have, I don't have a timeline for that, but we are looking at probably sometime next year.
So, and that's going to be a 100 unit building, is that
Yes,
correct?
I believe that's right. And I think that's our next one up. We're opening Hobson just any day now, which is down in the central district. And then we're back up to Aurora.
Okay, and that's going to be the same kind of building that you're talking about with the 24/7 staff.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
And okay, and you said that'll be opening sometime in 2021?
I believe so.
Do you have it?
I don't have a date.
Okay, thanks.
I see a question from Patricia. If I'm skipping over everyone, hopefully other moderators can help locate those questions. Patricia, do you want to ask your questions or like make a statement and get feedback from the guests? Oh, somebody needs to unmute Patricia. Technical difficulties. Patricia, I have unmuted you. If you'd like to ask. Or I'll just go ahead and ask since I'm failing at that.
I think I just unmuted.
Oh, awesome. Go ahead, please.
Do you? Yeah, I didn't realize I'm muted on my side too. So that's one thing. When you unmute me, I have to unmute myself just for others who might have that issue. Well, I did raise the issue about another thing that I hear often from people that I believe to be a misconception, and Catherine responded that it is in fact a misconception, that the more Seattle addresses homelessness and provides better services, that will just attract more homeless people from other areas to move here to access those services. And I never really know how to respond to that comment. So it'd be interesting to hear what the correct response is to that.
I'll jump in for a moment just as a business person and somebody that's tracked and been interested in homelessness and housing policy for 20 plus years. The reality is the number one reason for homelessness is high cost of housing. That's the baseline. If there's any marginal element, it's the high cost of housing. So if you really want to do something about general homelessness, bend the housing curve, right? It could be zoning, fees, permits, and in Third Door is not, we're not trying to tackle all of that, but I'm just telling you right now, the marginal cost of an apartment, single family home, all that is exactly where the precipice of marginalized homelessness occurs. You could look at weather data, you could look at services, I mean, this is 20 years ago, I've read all the studies. There's no high correlation between any of those things. The highest correlation is between single family housing prices and rent.
Yeah, I would add that, if you go to the DESC.org website, as I mentioned earlier, we have quite a bit of research on site that can help you answer questions like this. It is a fallacy that people move to Seattle because of the homeless services. There are people out there taking surveys every year and talking to people who are in shelters and who are moving into PSH. And the vast majority of people who are homeless in Seattle were housed in Seattle before they were homeless. They didn't move to Seattle as homeless people.
Yeah, and chronic homeless, frankly, they don't pick up and move across the country.
Exactly.
And that's the group that we're super focused on.
We're gonna go to a question from Diana. And Diana, I'm trying to unmute you if you'd like to ask. Oops, I messed up. Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, I just made some comments in the chatting box. That's what I was saying. I was just one was just a comment saying that I'm very glad that the businesses are taking leadership here, because often it's the nonprofits and the churches that are the fallback. So it's really great to see leadership in that direction. So it's just a comment. And then, to be honest, I can't remember my other question because I asked it earlier. So I'm sorry.
Holiday Inn.
The Holiday Inn.
Oh, yeah, the Holiday Inn. Yeah. Is that the one that, because Sharon Lee, I'm also on the task force for homelessness in Lake City, and Sharon Lee had been on a Zoom meeting a couple of weeks ago talking about the Holiday Inn on Aurora, and I was wondering if that was the same place.
I don't know.
Okay. I mean, it was a great proposal by Sharon Lee, so I
Yeah,
assume it's the same thing. Yeah.
we proposed, you know, at this time with COVID, there's distressed assets, and I think King County had bought a hotel and was able to convert it. And you know, there's some issues with that. It doesn't have everything, but you know, being able to buy it at $46,000 a unit and be able to do other things with that money, I think we have to look at all solutions on the table and see what can we do fast and now.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Karen, do you want to ask your question about who can access permanent supportive housing? I think you can unmute yourself.
Sure. I had 2 questions. What is the long-term finance plan like for these houses? I understand there's the upfront cost to fund getting the actual space, but then long-term, what does that look like to fund to keep these running? And then secondly, I was just curious if these homes are geared in any way for children or families to live in, and kind of what that split is between single individuals and places for families to go.
Yeah, I'll cover a couple of those, and Dell and Catherine, you can chime in on the last portion. So I think we calculated there's about 130 million to 150 million in annual supporting operating costs that would need to occur to support the additional units. So I think there would end up being about 13,000 units in all of King County. So, and there's already some funding for that. Again, we think that is the proper role for governmental source to continue to fund those pieces. And so we have proposed that permanent funding that would run in perpetuity as long as we needed to. I don't have the exact stats, but I think one thing to think about for the chronically homeless is that they tend to be single individuals. There are lots of family services. So you typically don't find chronically homeless families. It doesn't mean they don't exist, and I'm not here to say anything else. The average age, the last time I checked stats, it's a 52-year-old white male. And I think there's 60% male, 40% female. It's primarily a single group, and so the family homelessness has a lot of resources. And frankly, I think that's one of the misunderstood things right now is that actually we've done a great job around family homelessness. What is stacked up is the chronically homeless, which are mostly single people.
Chad, you answered that really well. I worked on family homelessness, communications and advocacy at Seattle U for 10 years. And it's very true that family homelessness, youth homelessness, they're the kinds of populations that funders look at and say, we can do something about that. Veteran homelessness, there's a lot of federal money to address that. But what hasn't been taken on is chronic homelessness. So that's why Third Door is focusing on it. There's a question from Vicki about whether we're looking to buying the property at the Black Angus property on Aurora and 125th, or the recently closed Green Lake Motel on Aurora. So Chad, maybe you could talk about, is it Third Door doing this buying and building, or are we trying to facilitate the buying and building?
Well, I think what we have done is propose some solutions, given a framework, and we're trying to pull together people to stand up some organizations to figure out how would an investment board work if it was a county-wide investment board where private enterprise, the government was putting in money. We already have lots of great service providers that are doing this. The Third Door does not want to be in the business. We're not in the business of building and buying properties. We think that there's a proper role for an investment board or another entity that actually does that. So when you look at the availability of property, I know that there's some level where we think that there's nothing available, but actually when you look at public property, publicly owned land that is available, and the recent changes in laws that allow that to be transferred to nonprofits for affordable housing or supportive housing, There's a tremendous amount of resources, and I know a couple of the tech companies that can go through all of the zoning and show us all of the availability of land that would not be great for typical household development, but would be great for supportive housing. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think that was, we're not the ones building it. There's lots of great people building and running. What we want to do is be a great idea generator to spur action for the county, the state, and the city.
Chad, there are a couple of questions about how maintenance of these properties is paid for and some concern that it's going to add to our tax burden.
Yeah, so I mean, here's the general deal is there is the maintenance of the properties is part of the nonprofits that run these. So whether it's Plymouth, DESC, Catholic Housing Services, et cetera, there is support that needs to occur to keep them going. And we have supported, I chair the Hospitality Association, and 2 years ago we supported revenues to support supportive housing. We believe that there is a role for King County wide to support that. And the economic analysis just shows that you can either keep trying to manage the problem or you can pay to solve it. And so you run a strict back of the house, back of the hand calculation on maybe it's about $50,000 a year to keep people chronically homeless, meaning you're paying for police services, emergency services, all these other things, plus just the sheer cost of businesses and other things that are on the streets versus $21,000 a year to keep them in a nice, safe, warm place. So you run the financial analysis anyway. It may cost you a little bit more upfront, but in the end, it costs you way less. And by the way, I'm an absolute fiscal conservative. I am somebody that does not want taxes for nothing. That's why, one of the pieces is how do we get cost-effective solutions done? And in the long run, this is how you do it. I build businesses. I invest in great assets to give me long-term returns, and permanent supportive housing is going to be one of those assets that we need to do.
I would just like to jump in there too and kind of reinforce what Chad was saying. It sounds like a lot of money, but it's really just a more, I think, of a choice about how we're going to spend that money. And when DESC started really pioneering the housing first approach in Seattle, we in 2005 we opened 1811 Eastlake 1811, and it was kind of a very new and controversial thing, but we were housing specifically what they call high utilizers, and this is those folks among the chronically homeless who are in and out of jail, in and out of ER, and spent costing taxpayers a lot of money. And in that first year, just by housing people, before you factor in any other kinds of services, the cost of housing them was about half the cost that it had been costing us when they were still living on the street. So, that it sounds like more money, more taxes, but it's actually a much more efficient, cost-effective way of solving the problem. And, I am moved by the human experience, but for people who are also, really concerned about how their taxes are spent, this is the cost-effective way to do it.
And I think we have time for one more question. Do we have another question, Catherine? Or I see a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
It's wonderful that so many people are asking how they can help. And we've seen some discussion about the Block Project, which is awesome. That's kind of an offshoot of the Facing Homelessness organization that a lot of people know on Facebook, which is a beautiful thing. Not for people who are chronically homeless. So we still need permanent supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless. Yep. I just posted in the chat our page with a list of ways that you can help if you'd like to get involved.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up, but I just want to
Actually, I'm gonna add one thing because
Go ahead. Yeah.
Forrest had added something, and this was a business leader that was involved early on, and he was pretty doubtful about all the supportive housing stuff, and until he ended up in the emergency room at Swedish Hospital in Ballard, and was in a car accident, and it wasn't a huge deal. He just needed MRI just to make sure there was nothing wrong, and there was an individual, I think he was there for maybe 5 hours waiting, right, to get seen. And there was an individual that had come in like 4 or 5 times, episodic times. And he went to the triage nurse. He's like, what is that a record for somebody coming back? And they're like, no, that's not even our highest user. The ER room is packed with the chronically homeless that are not getting the services, that end up back and back and back again. There's a reason why Harborview helped fund for Plymouth Housing on First Hill. They had 30 what they call clients that were their top users of emergency services that were doing 1.3 million in uncompensated care every year. And they said, if you will house these people, we will provide all of the nursing services and healthcare services for the rest of the other people, and we will save money. The ER rooms are packed with people. If you have to go to the ER room, you have to go to Triage Center, Harborview, you're going to be in for a shock if you've not been in one recently. And this is a way to start to calm that down, to reduce our expenses and help take care of people. So thank you, Forrest, for that comment, because I think it's super important. Our emergency rooms are overrun and have been.
I think Paul Lambros from Plymouth told us when we toured the building on First Hill that because they have a Harborview nurse on staff there, they're saving Harborview something like $3 million a year. Again, taxpayer money.
And I know we have Northwest Hospital out here in Northwest Seattle, and several people on the board of the Holler Lake Club and members of the Holler Lake community who work at the hospital and know firsthand the things that you're talking about as well. We're at 8:30. I don't want to keep anybody past their time. Thank you so much to our guests, Third Door Coalition, Chad and Catherine, and Dell from Downtown Emergency Services Center. From Downtown Emergency Services. This was great. Thank you everybody for joining from Holler Lake, from Bitterlake, from Broadview. Hopefully this was informative to you. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have ideas for getting Holler Lake involved, if you want us to, do something else, or band as a community around this issue, please get in touch. We have a website, or you can write to the board. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
My son was Zoom bombing us, so I'm heading out. Good night.